Burundi is still counting votes after an election that many see as a straight highway win for incumbent President Pierre Nkurunziza. Over the past months, there have been unrest, protests, reported heavy-handedness on the part of the government, and a botched coup. Nkurunziza has ignored calls from local and international bodies to postpone the election and not to seek a third term, which is the subject of the unrest. One such body is the International Republican Institute, which would have observed the election but pulled out in protest. Gretchen Birkle is the African Regional Director for the International Republican Institute, IRI, and she will tell us why, as well as walk us through some of the issues surrounding Burundi. Yeah, you're welcome to SaharaTV, Gretchen.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thanks for your time. First of all, let me ask you, why did the IRI boycott the monitoring the Burundi elections or observing the Burundi elections?
Thank you. And just to maybe clarify that question just a bit, we did not boycott. We did not have funding to monitor the elections, but consistent with the rest of the international community, the majority of the international community, we believed that this was not an election. The time was not ripe to send in observers for Election Day yesterday in Burundi.
Okay. So the decision was basically in consistency with the United States government's position on the Burundi elections, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. So other organizations, including the AU, the African Union, have boycotted the elections as well. This is actually the first time the AU has done that to any of its own members. How significant is this?
Right. Well, I think it is significant, and I think the government and President Nkurunziza need to look at this and consider how they're going to build and renew these relations and these regional ties. It is an important factor how such organizations as the AU and the UN and other neighbors can interact and view this election process. And so they will really need to, and he will really need to revisit how will you move forward in those relations.
Okay, and other presidential candidates have also boycotted the election, even though the EC maintained their photographs and their representation on the ballot boxes. Mm-hmm. Is this the right thing to do? Are they doing themselves and the people of Burundi a service, or are they just offering a platform for Nkurunziza to just sail on to victory?
Right. That's a very good question, and it's a difficult question to answer. I have very personal views about whether or not opposition candidates should boycott elections, because obviously, if you're boycotting, you're not getting the experience of running, and you're not offering a choice to the voters. But in this situation, I can see very much why the opposition felt that they should not run for these elections. It was a process that has been known for the last several months, since President Nkurunziza announced on April 25 that he would run. There's been an awful lot of violence, and there was a lot of good reasons to perhaps delay these elections and just hold off and revisit this at a later time. So it's very understandable why the opposition would boycott this.
Mm. The EU has also suspended €2 million out of a designated €8 million, which Burundi was supposed to receive to support its elections. Beyond this, though, in the very likely possibility of an Nkurunziza win, do you see the EU extending further measures to perhaps punish Nkurunziza's government?
Well, they may. I can't really address what their plans are. And the United States has already imposed some measures against the government. And according to news reports, the U.S. government is also considering some additional steps specifically against individuals who would be promoting violence there. And so these are real important considerations. The situation is very volatile still. There were deaths yesterday. There have been more than 70 deaths over the last 3 months leading up to these elections. And so it's understandable that the international community feels like they need to make some important steps, take some important measures to prevent continued violence.
And at what point is the United States going to make a loud statement, a statement that would resound to the world what the position is of the United States in Burundi? You've already mentioned certain sanctions that have been put in place, but are these loud enough? At what point is the United States really going to make its voice heard on what's going on in Burundi?
Right. I do believe the United States has been loud about it, and they have put statements out. They did put a statement out yesterday or the day before that these elections lack credibility. They called on the government to delay the elections. When the regional leaders were meeting, I believe it's been about a month now in Arusha recently, with the EAC, Assistant Secretary Thomas Greenfield was there. We've been very active and working with the government of Burundi to revisit whether or not these elections should take place and to postpone them. So I do believe the U.S. government has been forceful in expressing its desire to delay these elections and to say that they really do lack credibility. It's clear that a third term is against the Constitution of Burundi. That is a founding document for any country, and it is really a document that needs to be honored and respected. And we see across the continent that incumbent leaders are really trying to maneuver and manipulate the rule of law to ensure that they have a third term. And that's really not something that the United States stands for.
How is this going to affect relations between Burundi and the United States?
I think, as I mentioned, I think there's some rebuilding that will need to be done. Elections are one part of the political process in a country. And the political aspect of a country is one part of its relationship with the United States. I can't speak on behalf of the United States government, but it's certainly there will need to be some rebuilding here in this relationship.
Okay, before we go, let me ask you: you obviously aren't monitoring the elections on the ground, but I believe you, and when I say you, I mean the IRI, is still monitoring the Burundi elections from a distance. What have you heard so far?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Electoral Commission has said that there has been about a 74% turnout on the vote. I think that's fairly high. We'll see some final results either Thursday, tomorrow, or early Friday, and I'm curious to see what final numbers will say. So out of 3.8 million eligible voters in Burundi, a 74% turnout to me seems a bit high. I think that's higher than the turnout for the legislative elections last month. So I'm curious to see what the final number will be.
Have you heard any news of people voting under duress? Because if 70-something% of the population are turning out to vote normally, that would say something for Pierre Nkurunziza, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm. It would, and and that's very possible, and that is certainly something that could happen. I have not heard of anything specific about people voting under duress. I have heard of some violence yesterday. Any loss of life is tragic, and there was at least 2 deaths reported yesterday, which is a real tragedy for the country and for this process.
Finally, Gretchen, the IRI also works in several other African countries. You have engagements in the past with Nigeria. Can you share with us what your engagement in Nigeria has been like in recent times?
Yes, in fact, IRI, along with our partners, the National Democratic Institute and the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, have worked in Nigeria since about 1999, since the introduction of multi-party democracy. And just to contrast the current situation in Burundi with the recent very successful elections in March of this year in Nigeria, it's really striking. Today in Washington, D.C., this week, Washington warmly welcomed the new transparently elected president of Nigeria, President Muhammadu Buhari. IRI just co-hosted an event with the U.S. Institute of Peace at which he spoke, and it was really striking to see the great hope in the room, with many senior diplomats and members of the foreign policy community from Washington really optimistic that Nigeria has put itself on the right trajectory with the international community. And something very specific that President Buhari did was make a very gracious comment about the very gracious way that former president of Nigeria, Goodluck Jonathan, accepted defeat. And that was a real testimony to both of those individuals about how a peaceful transition could take place and should take place. And it's an extraordinary model for the rest of Africa. And I just think it's a shame that this situation will not benefit the citizens of Burundi. They could have had a similar process, a similar positive trajectory in their democratic path forward. And they will now not benefit from such a situation.
Gretchen Birkle, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Gretchen Birkle is the Africa Director for the International Republican Institute, IRI. This is SaharaTV. Stay tuned. We have more coming.